So I have to begin with the sort of now obligatory LLM foundation model generated image. Here's what Gemini came up with as an offering for my topic here today. And it's sort of get some things right, doesn't get other things right, and I think that will be a theme throughout the talk today, right? Because it's really exciting stuff and also some deeply concerning stuff. And if you'd like to follow along today, the slides have a lot of references to work at the bottom of each slide, and there's also a link to the paper that inspired this talk, which is called Can Generative AI Improve Social Science, which I published about 2 years ago. So a few things have changed, and I have done my best to rapidly update the references. Even when I published that article, a reviewer very importantly and usefully pointed out to me that I think 60% of the references were preprints then. So it's the nature of this field that I think things are changing so rapidly that we all have to reperform literature reviews much faster than we might like. I'm going to sort of cover two themes. And the first is sort of the optimistic take, and I think historically have fallen on the optimist side of the continuum, although lately I'll share some more recent research which is pushing me more towards the pessimist side of things. But I'll begin just with a survey of sort of some of the areas, first with the sort of low-hanging fruit, the things that seem to work pretty well, and then some new work that our lab, I lead a lab called the Polarization Lab, which does a lot of human-AI interaction research. We've created a platform where humans interact with large groups of large language models, and we've done some work using large language models to do conflict mediation, things like that. So I want to kind of get to the stuff that I think might be most interesting to this crowd, and skip over some of the more rudimentary stuff that I suspect, reading your bios, many of you already know. So the first area where I think, is I used to teach natural language processing at Duke, and the joke even 6 or 7 years ago is you rewrote the syllabus every year. Okay, the neural networks, okay, now there's a whole new thing, right? Embeddings, there's a whole new thing. And so, recently I was giving a talk, and a young graduate student said, do I need to learn natural language processing anymore? Now there's LLMs. And the student had read papers like this is an early paper by Caleb Zeems, who's and D.E. Young, who's a wonderful young computer scientist at Stanford. And they had taken a bunch of data from social science fields or social science adjacent fields like history. And these were human annotated data, and they had done the sort of zero-shot prompting thing, looked at different levels of analysis, and discovered, pretty reasonable, accuracy recall scores across the different disciplines, and with different levels of analysis. And that got a lot of people excited. There was some course variation. Skipping ahead to, where's this slide? There was of course variation, right, as the models got better. The accuracy seemed to improve, unsurprisingly, although this same team recently told me that the move from GPT-4 to GPT-5 actually had minimal or even negative impacts on this. So that's whether the scaling laws hold for social sciences, I think, a really fascinating question. Similarly, this team is looking at psychometrics, a sort of very well understood tool, dictionary-based classifier for measuring psychometric properties in text, known as linguistic inquiry word count, and simply ran this in multiple different languages, and again, concluded that there are reasonably high scores, and that these scores persist across even languages that are not well represented in the training data. A lot of excitement here around this. Another paper, both of these appeared in PNAS in the last few years, suggests the LLMs are doing at least as well as crowd workers, and we could debate about how crowd workers compare to the poor undergrads we typically hire to code our documents for us. But again, some pretty sensational claims that LLMs are at least meeting the human performance or even exceeding it. Now, as I step back and think about the last few years of the literature as a whole, I would I would sort of add a few qualifiers. I would say for very, very well-defined metrics, we were just hearing about complicated healthcare coding, and I think that's a good example of something that's not so clear-cut. But if we're talking about like actuary tables and whether or not someone died in an obituary, these are the kinds of things that it seems like an LLM it can be trusted with. But if we're measuring things like that might come up in John's lab, like democracy, right? Like is this text democratic? I think these are the areas where we start to see fail points. And just to build on something that the previous speaker was just describing, the interesting thing, and this will be another theme of this talk, is how can we recognize the limitations of LLMs, the limitations of humans, and sort of explore the interesting space between. And I think in automated text analysis, the future is really taking advantage of the unlimited attention of LLMs and developing a hybrid workflow which could identify these kind of sweet spots where we can take advantage of what LLMs do well, what humans do well. Okay. This is just another plot that compares human to LLM-based ratings of that linguistic inquiry word count tool, just showing that across the models and across different types of emotions, there's pretty strong correlation. All right. The next area that I think really exploded in 2023 with a paper written by Lisa Argyle, who's a brilliant young political scientist at Purdue, and she had a long-running collaboration with a really interesting team of computer scientists at BYU, and they put out this paper which basically showed that GPT-3, when prompted to answer questions to the American National Election Survey, which is like a very well-known, very prominent survey that we conduct before and after elections, that if the model was given a persona, prompted with, for example, demographic information or maybe a few other attitudes, that the correspondence between the LLM output and the human output was really strong. So you can see here, these are open-ended questions, and at the end of a survey, when here a Democrat is asked to describe a Republican and vice versa, and the LLM is asked to do the same thing, and the correspondence and the types of words used is very similar. And then when we look at the actual responses, and this is GPT-3, so even with early models, it's really, really close to a lot of important kinds of outcomes that a political scientist might care about, like vote in the 2016 election, interest in politics, whether or not you discuss politics. Now, when this first came out, I think there was a lot of naive optimism, like, oh, we don't need to do surveys anymore, and now, knowing Lisa, the author of this article very well, who's a co-author of mine, she would say, absolutely not, right? As we'll see when we get into some of the current research on some of the well-documented tendencies of LLMs to homogenize populations, to exert bias, we're very far from that point. But I think it's fair to say, and I think Lisa, the author of this paper, would agree that there's probably still some utility in using LLMs to, for example, pre-test surveys or to evaluate the robustness of our survey instruments. And others like Igor Grossman and Nicholas Christakis in a recent piece have argued that there are also other trade-offs worth considering. So for example, so many of us study college students, and college students are limited in they're not very diverse, right? And so if we look at social psychology, there's a lot of concern about studying the same type of demographics. And one might argue that even an imperfect representation of a more diverse sample could be interesting. So these are the kinds of questions that I'm closely tracking and very interested in, but again, I think become more complicated when we get to the state of the art of the literature. The third sort of big area, and here again, I suspect a lot of you have seen all this, so I'm going to go through it quickly, but I'm happy to discuss it further in the Q&A if you're interested. And this is sort of synthetic experiments. So here the LLM is prompted to not only answer a survey, like the previous study I just described, but then you expose the LLM, or a researcher exposes the LLM to some kind of intervention. It could, typically it's a survey experiment in an online setting, so in a treatment condition, one group reads a vignette, and in the other condition they don't, and maybe the vignette includes scary language, and we're trying to see whether the treatment could induce some kind of emotional reaction, population. So there's a lot of interesting work in this space. John Hortman, MIT Economics, has a number of nice papers basically showing that you can reproduce like Danny Kahneman's findings, from behavioral economics and with actually pretty impressive, precision. But there's an obvious issue with that, which is that, Danny Kahneman wrote the best-selling academic book ever, right? And so surely the training data is sort of a wash and knows these patterns and certain, it's performative and not anything we would really get excited about. It's really just information retrieval, if you like. Well, I thought that too until I read this really interesting preprint by Rob Wheeler and colleagues at Stanford. And here they took a sort of well-known in the social science community set of data sets that's called tests. So here people were taking surveys in return for getting free internet over a 10 or 15 year period, and hundreds of studies were conducted. Most of them were survey experiments. And the interesting and intriguing detail is that many of these were never published. And so you can now start to see, okay, well, how much is this just in the training data? And here's the correlation across about 800 experiments. Here's the actual treatment effect in the human population, and here's the GPT-4 predicted treatment effect. And the correlation is 0.91, which when I first read that, I thought, like, wow, that is very, very strong correlation. As a social scientist, historically speaking, we'd be pretty excited if we, or not excited, but we'd be pretty impressed by a correlation of that size. Oh dear. So what about the unpublished versus published stuff? Well, first up here, we have the overall effect that we were just looking at. But here, panel C here suggests that the effect remains strong, maybe even the little fly grows a little bit for unpublished studies. It gets better with model performance. And even once we start to look at things like whether the authors are well known or whether the discipline is, whether it's in one discipline or another, this pretty strong correlation seems to persist. So still quite a lot of excitement about experiments and synthetic experiments, but just like with surveys and knowing this team well, I think they would say, we're still not ready to take humans out of the process, right? This is probably most useful for, assessing possible treatment effects. And even there, I think we might have concerns. But you can imagine, earlier I was arguing that, a case could be made that we could potentially generate more diverse samples if we use LLMs. We could potentially diversify the population of researchers who are able to do experiments using LLMs. And that's one of the more interesting, I think, things that I'm keeping my eye on in this part of literature, although I think, very few people are ready to say that, there are any fields. And by the way, these studies have now been reproduced in fields like psychology with, dozens and dozens of psychology experiments, and the effects are more or less the same, a little less strong. And there's a piece that recently came out in PNAS has it about 0.67 is the average. LLM, the average correlation between the LLM treatment effects and the real human effects. Okay, so we've got text analysis, we've got synthetic surveys, we've got synthetic experiments. Many of us social scientists, I think, who had a background in agent-based modeling or full-scale social simulation thought, well, if these things can simulate survey responses and they can simulate treatment effects, why can't they, be part of agent-based models? And of course, the sort of glass half full story here is that, well, the limitation of agent-based models was always that they were constrained by their inability to produce language, and so surely an LLM that can, in a context-aware way, produce language, especially in interaction with other agents, could be really intriguing. And so some colleagues of mine and I set out to do what is now, I think, a very crazy experiment. And again, when we get to limitations, you'll see why we think this is a little crazier than we did back in 2023 when we wrote this paper. We took the American National Election Study, that same survey that you just saw. We obtained from that data on how often people use Twitter and how often they post and what types of things they post about. We created personas. We used an RSS feed from a day in the middle of GPT-3's training period, and we decided to ask, how closely could we approximate an hour of Twitter conversations among, let's say 1,000 agents. And, we created this synthetic timeline where people post and they've been commenting on each other's posts and so on and so forth. And the sort of, at first it was sort of a toy example, and there are a number of these papers. In the paper that I linked at the beginning of the presentation, I counted at least 12 as of 2024, early 2024. I think now there's probably several dozen papers exploring agent-based simulations of LMs. But the exciting thing was in this paper, we were able to reproduce the effects from a field experiment that our lab did in 2018, where we paid people to follow Twitter users who had opposing views and documented a sort of counterintuitive finding, which was that exposing people to those with opposing views seemed to actually increase polarization rather than reducing polarization as we had originally hoped. And so we got really excited and thought, okay, well now we're seeing a whole system level, like maybe, just maybe LMs could be useful for really approximating the whole system. And you might say again, okay, well, why would you want to do that? And I think one argument would be that there's a whole family of studies in social science that we really struggle to study. So extremism, the worst parts of the internet, exploitation of children on the internet, things where we really can't ethically experiment. And you might argue that actually these things are really capable of simulating places like the dark web because of the prevalence of training data produced in these areas. And so perhaps, particularly for these very difficult to study issues, LLMs could be useful in explaining, for example, radicalization processes, which is something I've been interested in over the years. Okay. The next area that we got really excited about in my lab was generative AI intervention. So, for example, actually using AI to, in our case, mediate conflict on social media. And so Lisa Argyle, one of the scientists who I mentioned at the outset, she and I had had the idea in this PNS paper from 2023 to try to see whether an LLM could be trained to do evidence-based conflict mediation. And so we got about 1,600 people who had either pro or anti-gun control attitudes, and we prompted them to talk to each other on a simple kind of chat platform. But in the study's treatment condition, one of the two people begins to get recommendations from an LLM that invoke one of three evidence-based, and this was early days of GPT-3, so we were sort of limited in what GPT-3 could do well, but we discovered it could do things like active listening. So, if you're married, one of the most important things you can do to improve communication in your marriage is to rehearse the beliefs or concerns of your partner back to them to demonstrate that they've been heard, right? And this is also critical. Polarization research shows in preventing people from talking past each other, right? So in a typical argument, Republicans and Democrats decide to go at it. They both feel misunderstood or unheard, and things get worse, right? And so the thought experiment was like, well, what if we can put an LLM in between two people, or at least one of them, and nudge that person to rehearse the other person's argument back to them. We do this by having, putting the prior conversation in the context window and prompting the model to invoke certain techniques from certain studies that we very carefully confirmed it could do through a bunch of piloting. And then the hope is that people would have a better conversation. And first we looked at, where and how people were using LLM, and this is a little, it's getting very meta now, but we're using LLMs to analyze the LLM intervention up here with GPT-4 reading the context, the topic of the conversations. But what was really exciting is in this paper, we think the evidence suggests that the more people used the LLM, and it was optional, I should have mentioned that, right? We didn't force anybody to use the LLM. It was a button that said, would you like to change your message, right? And about 67% of people in the treatment condition actually decided to change their message. Others edited their message. And so it improved both reports of conversational quality, which is apologies for the political science speak, but it's basically how stressful was the conversation, how productive was it, and so on. And then democratic reciprocity, which is again political scientists speak for, how much do you want to have similar conversations across political divides? So in both cases, the LLM seemed to help. That was really exciting, and now many of you may know the many articles that have come out since ours, like For example, Dave Rand's group has a really nice paper that shows that LMs can perhaps dissuade people from believing in conspiracy theories. Chris Summerfield at Cambridge has a really nice paper that shows LMs can perhaps help small groups of people deliberating about social problems to arrive at consensus faster. So it seems like there's some family of interventions, at least in this narrow part of social science concerned with political communication, that LMs can do some good. Okay. But the area that I'm personally most excited about is this kind of hybrid place, the space in between, you know, human to human, human to AI, and AI to AI. And, you know, I think I get overexcited about this, and I think, you know, sometime, hopefully you'll tell me if I'm being naive. But I think, you know, typically we've sort of been stuck in this human to human realm. We're beginning to explore the human to AI realm. I give an example of the AI to AI realm. But what's really interesting is going back and forth between these two. So if you think, you know, you can imagine prototyping something in the AI to AI realm, then doing a study where you sort of maybe implement some of those interventions in the human to AI space, like the study I just described, and then, and only then, do you put them at the human to human level. And actually that paper that I just described, we were talking about academic industry collaborations earlier. We did a collaboration with Nextdoor, which is, I hate to say it, or was at the time, America's most toxic social media platform, despite being the social media platform that's meant to bring us together with our neighbors, right? We did a one-year study implementing the LM-based intervention tool that I just described, which precipitated, we think, about a 15% decrease in the use of toxic language on the platform. So, you know, there's a sort of, perhaps a life cycle of research that one could argue could be changing. I think it's really exciting. But as we begin to create these kinds of new workflows, we need new platforms, we need so much infrastructure. And so in our lab, we've been working on something called the Human AI Research Platform. And this is an environment for all sorts of research on human AI interaction, but our background is mostly in social media research. And so what we do is, we do a lot of work trying to, maybe I can shut that off. Maybe not too easily, sorry. We do a lot of work trying to look at environmental features of the social media platform. So, you know, this is like a, typical story, right? Like, people are very different online than they are in real life, and, many of us are concerned that when you get exposed to incivility online, that there's some sort of toxic spiral of incivility, that incivility begets incivility, that this probably increases animosity, and it also, and perhaps most importantly, and I wrote a whole book about this, that it probably also, makes moderates retreat, right? And so social media just becomes increasingly toxic and increasingly unattractive to the vast majority of people who have more moderate views. When they see these uncivil views, they just retreat. So this is a very well, trodden idea. I think probably most of you have heard of it already or thought about it. But it's an example of an idea that's really hard for a social scientist to test. So if you think about the perfect experiment to test this hypothesis, I would love to go into, let's say, Facebook or Meta or wherever, and say, okay, I want to permute this person's feed to only include uncivil language, and I want to keep this person's feed civil, and then I want to track them for 2 months, right? And I want to know everything about them and everything they clicked on. And I'm seeing smiles in the room, which means some of you work with these kinds of data. This is a ridiculous example, right? Like, Meta's not going to let us take the first step in doing that for good reasons too, right? Not just because they're concerned about PR issues, I think, but more importantly because of user experience, right? Like, it could be unethical to expose people to high degree of incivility. And by the way, we couldn't control that incivility. That could include hate speech, or it could include just minor ad hominems, right? And everything in between. So if we're thinking about, what AI can do well, right? If it's true that, LMs can provide sort of useful approximations of human behavior, and if, and only if, they're very steerable, then potentially we could do a new kind of experiment where we control group level behavior, which for social scientists is often the thing that we're out to study, right? How does a group level behavior change individual level behavior? This sort of micro-macro link is central to a lot of what we do. And so we created this platform, and here's us up in the lab coats up there. We all wear coats in our lab, and you guys do that here, but, just for keeping up good impressions. And we recruit people from places like Prolific, so these are online panelists. And we typically tell them, we are recruiting you to help test a new social media platform. And we tell them that to do this, they have to install an iOS or Android app. It's called Spark Social, and we tell them this backstory. It's a modest amount of deception. We say, Spark Social is a company that helps upstart social media companies test their products. So they come on, they install our app, and the app can do a bunch of stuff. It can turn on and off different features of social media platforms. So for example, if you wanted to do a study to assess the impact of the like button, something that gets talked about a lot but has never really been carefully studied, you can give one set of users a feed with a like button and one without it, or you could change the algorithm used to rank content in the news feed. We've done other studies where we've given people sort of badges for being open-minded. You can control the whole feature space, the content that people see, but perhaps most interesting to this crowd, you can deploy large groups of LLMs who are carefully prompted to resemble either observable populations or some other population of interest. And so here, the platform also implements Qualtrics natively into the platform. So before and after the intervention, we can ask people questions. Like for example, here we want to know, does exposure to incivility increase animosity? And then it also generates, we think, really cool attitudinal and behavioral data. So for example, those of us who have studied social media for a long time are often interested in impressions, like how often people see something, right? And we often don't have that denominator in our calculations because it's so hard to get that data. It's very, very sensitive to privacy. But we can, through informed consent, request all sorts of data from our panelists. And we also tell them, by the way, that they may encounter AI in the platform, so we even disclose that. But in a paper that's coming out in the American Journal of Political Science, we show that exposing people on our platform to a modest, very modest amount of incivility. So don't think hate speech here. This is just like, someone's using the term jerk. Okay, so it's kind of quaint in social media speak, really, right? So historically speaking, it could be a lot worse. But in our sort of civil feed, and I guess you could argue that maybe that's the real intervention, given that the baseline is maybe more uncivil these days. But in one feed, the bots are prompted carefully through very carefully and rigorously pre-tested personas on pilot samples to produce and simulate sort of people from different political perspectives. So here Republicans and Democrats are talking about energy policy in this particular study. But in the treatment condition, they're getting this modest amount of incivility. And so, the hypothesis, of course, was that, there's this sort of spiral of toxicity. And what we found was, we did find that, but we found something we think even more interesting. The first thing is that if you ask people how comfortable were you with sharing your opinions in this online environment when they were exposed to uncivil people, unsurprisingly, people say, I was less comfortable, right? This was unpleasant. However, this second effect there suggests people are actually making more posts in that uncivil condition and more comments. And when they make those comments, they're more likely to be toxic, suggesting that there could be a sort of performative dimension to all this. People don't want to be toxic. They feel they should be toxic in response to other toxic people. And if everybody knew that everybody else was being toxic just because they thought this was the norm, then social media might look quite different. So these are the kinds of studies that we think are now possible with a bespoke kind of platform for social science research. Shifting now into the challenges, I'll begin with one that I know everyone in this room knows very well, and that's bias, right? We know that large language models tend to evince the values and characteristics of people who are well represented in their training data. And so this is a really nice paper by Sonderker et al. This is a Stanford group, and basically they take a bunch of surveys from Pew, which is a very well-known and well-understood survey population, and they prompt a lot of different LLMs to take a lot of different surveys. And basically what they find here is that, groups like elderly female Republicans who live in rural areas are very poorly approximated by the LMs, but young male Democrats from San Francisco, unsurprisingly, are pretty well represented by LMs. So we know the direction of the bias here. And there's some subsequent studies that say, like, maybe we can correct for this bias once we know where the bias is. Biased algorithms are easier to fix than biased people, maybe, and again, trade-offs, right? But there's yet another problem, which is the homogenization of populations. So here we're looking at the World Value Survey, so not just the US, we're looking at countries all over the world. And in the yellow here is the actual human data, and we're looking at a bunch of different questions related to happiness. All those, the Scandinavians are famously the most happy people. Well, that's this survey, right? And so you can see actually there's a lot of variance in happiness, there's a lot of variance in political attitudes, there's a lot of variance in religious beliefs. But if we look at what the models are doing, and here you can see GPT-4, Llama, Mistral, they're basically collapsing that variance. And so, the literature, I think, is beginning to converge on the consensus that even though an LM might provide a useful approximation of the mean values of a population, we often care much more about the variance, right? Especially if you're studying something like I do, like polarization. It's actually really important that there's that diversity of beliefs, and that's actually the thing we're out to study. So homogenization, huge problem, and this is well known to machine learning researchers for a long time, right? All these kinds of trade-offs, but we're definitely having a reckoning with it in the data. This is another new paper. Earlier I mentioned the generative agent-based model that we did that simulated Twitter, and we validated that in a very clumsy way in this paper. We just sort of went and did some sort of LM-based analysis and did some sort of very small-scale, in-depth qualitative analysis, and it looked right, but we didn't do anything systematic. And so this collaboration that's now been going on for 2 years, we've been using all sorts of open source LLMs to try to see whether they can reproduce the language of real social media users who have been studied for years through longitudinal surveys that are linked to behavioral data. So we know everything about these people, we know how they talk over time, we know what they voted for, we know what they think of the murder of George Floyd, we know all these things, right? And we're here, what we're trying to do is see how much these LLMs can confuse a BERT classifier, which has been trained to try to distinguish human from LLM generated text. There's a bunch of reasons why we use BERT instead of humans, but basically what you see here is higher scores mean that the BERT classifier is able to differentiate the two, and lower means the model is better at tricking humans, basically. And so what you can see is all of these models, especially the new reasoning models, are actually not doing well at all. They're like, the BERT classifier is identifying the LM with 95% accuracy, which is pretty crazy. Interestingly, some of the smaller models, and this new open source model, Apparatus, have you all heard of this from ETH Zurich? It's one of the first open source models for science, which I think is really interesting. Also doing a little better. And the interesting puzzle here is if the scaling models hold, right, we would think better models, better simulation. Actually, we're seeing the opposite, which I think either means that humans are much more complicated or much less complicated than we think they are, right? And we can do a little better with things like fine-tuning. So here, in addition to just the raw data, we give the model persona. That makes it a little more accurate, so that doesn't seem to help at all. If we give it a sense of user style by giving it a few examples of previous user text, that seems to help quite a bit. If we give it more context, longer and longer context, it's doing better. Fine-tuning, though, is not helping. So again, just an interesting puzzle that we're keeping our eyes on and don't have a great way of making sense yet, but it seems like, as in so many other areas, we still have a long way to go before we can really, use LMs with strong confidence as sort of perfect surrogates for the types of human behavior we used to study previously. Another huge challenge, and I know I'm getting short on time, is replicability. So, we all know these things are probabilistic, right? If we ask the same question 10 times, even to the same model, we get 10 different answers. And, social science, especially since the replication crisis, so-called replication crisis in psychology, has been very concerned with replicability. And, many people have argued, I think quite convincingly, that this is a real challenge, right? If we can do things like maybe we can specify the temperature parameter and which exact model we used, and maybe we can have slightly more reproducible research, but it's never going to be perfectly reproducible. And again, someone might say, well, humans, if we resurvey humans, they tend to change their minds in ways that we wouldn't. So, maybe this is not not a big deal, but for people who are very firmly in the open science camp, it's created a real challenge. Ethics, obviously, this is a huge one. In our own lab, we spent a lot of time trying to think, to what extent should we always disclose the use of AI in human-to-AI experimentation? And we've sort of taken a safe approach to always disclose. I know many researchers who are arguing you shouldn't always have to disclose, so I think that is a kind of new kind of problem that we have as researchers. But just as, and I'll show you the creepy images that Gemini came up when I asked it to discuss the ethical challenges of social science research with AI. This looks dark, but there could also be opportunities. So when I published this paper that I linked to the beginning, I was prepared for a long and very involved discussion with many people around ethics, and especially the reviewers, many of whom I suspect were social scientists. And we, as computational social scientists, this is the field that I come from, we have a long history of terrible mistakes. We've created experiments that unintentionally triggered, surveillance by authoritarian regimes. We've compromised the privacy of undergraduates by studying them on Facebook. We've made a lot of mistakes. So I personally take this issue really seriously, and kind of in the paper was giving all these new reasons why, generative AI could create new ethical dilemmas. But one reviewer in particular said, actually, it probably fixes some issues. So for example, in previous work, when we were doing these sort of bespoke social media platforms for social science research, we built a platform where we linked one real Democrat and a real Republican, this was years ago, 5 years ago, to have a conversation. We were interested in the effect of anonymity on those conversations. And so some of these conversations became very toxic, and people were abusing each other. We even had to shut a few conversations down. We had to staff a content moderation team. We had, an ML pipeline that was flagging possibly toxic stuff. And the reviewer said, actually, you don't have this problem anymore, to the extent that, and it's a big if large language models are steerable, right, and if we at least know the types of behavior we can expect from them, maybe it's less of a risk if you want to do something like, for example, understand the effect of incivility to have a much more steerable model. It's an interesting argument, one that I don't think anybody has worked out. Obviously, hallucination is perhaps less of a problem than it was in the early days, but I think it's still a pretty big problem. Here's Llama 3, which credits me for inventing DALL-E. I did not invent DALL-E, in case it's not clear. So, I think the bigger picture problem, and I think so many of you are probably hearing or seeing these kinds of things, the use of LLMs to write grant proposals, the use of LLMs to write entire publications, right? And we've all heard examples of LLMs producing papers that snuck through the review process, right? And of course, the model collapse story here is that eventually all that shoddy science goes into the next generation of training, and we wind up unable to differentiate the two, and especially because of text watermarking is so hard, right? Maybe we won't be able to differentiate. It's a big problem. Environmental impact, again, I'm not an expert in this area. I suspect many of you know a lot more about it than I do, but at any time I'm talking to, say, a young student who's considering, doing a dissertation where they're perhaps going to create thousands of agents and have them interact with each other for days, right? Obviously the biggest cost, as this graph shows, are probably in the training process, but even in the inference level, and even with, local models, and at Duke, for example, we're experimenting with data centers that regenerate energy through the heat generated by cooling down GPUs and things like that. So we're making progress, but I think it's really critical that we think, especially if we engage en masse in large new sort of efforts, to be mindful of the environmental impact. So what are the next steps? One concern I have is that we will sort of, as in so many other fields of AI, just make snap judgments like, this is good, this is bad, or AI can do this, and AI can't do this. And I worry that a lot of our opinions about this are sort of frozen in time. And even though maybe the scaling laws aren't holding, there's all sorts of other advances going on that I think mean we have to, as a community, continually reappraise these questions. I personally believe there's a place for generative AI in social science, maybe not what many of us had originally hoped it might be, but it's going to take some work to get there. So we need to patiently be evaluating new models. I also really believe we need to build our own infrastructure, which is why I briefly flagged Pertus, that new model from ETH Zurich. One of the reasons why these models evince bias is because of the process through which they're fine-tuned, reinforcement learning and human feedback. The decisions are being made to optimize for really consumer products, right? To make models friendlier and kinder. Maybe as social scientists, we don't want that. We actually want the bias. We want the raw models. And so I proposed at the end of this article that one of the most important things we could potentially do is to think together about what a model for social science would actually look like and how we would get there. There'd be enormous challenges related to, training costs and infrastructure and access and preventing, safety issues. There's a lot we need to think through. But one of the reasons I feel very passionate about this is having watched, like I think many of you, the field of social media research unfold. And precisely because we didn't create our own infrastructure, we became dependent, I would argue, on large corporations, and probably shouldn't be surprised that we never got all the data we might have liked out of these corporations. Lastly, I think that, especially as we move into the so-called agentic world or the multi-agent world, I really think social science has a role to play in model development itself. So at the end of this article, I talk about, sociological work on the social sense, giving models a sense of what a reasonable person would do in a social context, right? So much of our work is just a dyadic interaction between one individual and a chatbot, but for models to do all the things that, especially the people spreading all the hype would like them to do, right? Mediate conflict within an organization, hire and fire people, right? All these complex organizational roles, right? They surely need a deeper understanding of things like social networks, which is the real strength of you all that I greatly admire. And I worry that social science, much like this story of social media, is a little underrepresented at the table where we're building the models. Okay, lastly, just thinking again about whether and how we should change the sort of circle of inductive to deductive or synthetic to human research. And I think just exploring the spaces in between these modalities is really going to be a sweet spot for social science in the coming years. And before I conclude, I just want to give a quick plug for a free training program. So I know there's at least a few graduate students here, or maybe you all are faculty of grad students. I see one of our shining examples in the back there. The Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science are free programs that run in 71 locations around the world. And they're both designed to provide access to high quality training, but also to incubate cross-disciplinary research. And actually, 4 of the studies I talked about today were generated at one of these institutes, which we're all very proud of. The sort of neat thing about the community is that it started as just an effort to take the curriculum that I had designed and a Princeton professor had designed and sort of spread it internationally. But what we've since learned is that it's much better to use the crowd. So everyone who organizes one of these sites is an alum of one of the original sites, and they now put their content back into an open source repo, which is available on our website, sicss.io, or sometimes we call it 6, that allows you to hopefully benefit from crowd-generated teaching materials, data sets, annotated code, and so on and so forth. So if you're new to the field and want to start to explore some of these methods and you're a young scholar, we have 21 sites running this year. Those are all in yellow. We used to run one at Northeastern. Actually, I don't know if anyone knows Sheriff Shostak or Ryan Gallagher, old PhD students, at least one person at the table. And David has been involved in the past. So if you all would like to organize a site, we also have limited funding through NSF, still through NSF, and the Templeton World Charity Foundation to continue to expand these. So we'd love to talk to you about collaborating on education and sort of spreading the word. And lastly, at Duke, I'll just give one last final plug. We just created our brand new Society-Centered AI initiative, and we're running our second annual conference, February 12th to February 14th, so probably too short notice. But we have a wonderful group of speakers and research talks, and we're trying to incubate this kind of research, both in social science and beyond. So I'm just so excited to, again, hear all of your talks. I really, again, came at this subject with a lot of humility, prepared to hear I'm wrong about all sorts of stuff, and learn from you all. But it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you, John, for inviting me. Thanks to the Knight Foundation. Thank you to Libby, and thank you to all of you.